Have you ever wondered why you're mad when someone took your words and repeated them back to you? Maybe you used those words to describe yourself at one time, and maybe at that time they felt empowering, like you were stepping forward with your very best self. And at the time, it also might have felt the most authentic to you. But then time goes by. 6 months, a year, 2 years, and then the person is repeating those words back to you. And suddenly you feel exposed, judged, pissed off, misunderstood, and it almost feels like they're placing a label on you. So your current self is shook. You're like, I no longer identify with that as my truth. And you're basically taking the things that I said 2 years ago, and you're saying that that is my current truth. And as you're sitting here, I'm sure there's one thing that comes to mind for you where it's like, yes, I've had this happen to me before. I know what it's like. Okay, so keep that example in mind as we go throughout the episode. So as we're feeling all these feelings around, like, you just repeated my own words back to me and they no longer resonate, a few questions come to mind. The first question is, are you mourning the fact that you've outgrown an old version of yourself? Are you frustrated that you once labeled yourself as something that was never true to begin with? Or maybe you felt like it was true at the time, but as you think about it a little bit more, you realize it was coming from a wounded place. Or are you frustrated that somebody only sees you as one thing because you've only given them one thing to see? And with any of these questions, there's clearly a gap between how you see yourself and how others see you. And so what I really want to explore today is, like, how can we close that gap? So let's get into it. Now, a couple days ago, this showed up for me in the form of somebody quoting back words that I had written on my LinkedIn profile. Now, I already know what you're thinking. You're like, Allie, you always go for these career-related examples. And yes, that's true, because the one category in my life where everything feels super high stakes is career, because there's always been so much emphasis that was put around it. And so oftentimes when I'm really being pushed to grow and evolve, I'm tested and triggered in career, because that's the thing that I care about the most at the end of the day. And so what had happened was a salesperson had cold emailed me. And in that email, they were quoting something that I had written in my LinkedIn About section, where I was basically saying that I have expertise in making the most out of constrained resources. Now, on the surface, that's great, right? Good on the salesperson for doing their research, going to my LinkedIn profile, finding something that resonates with them and that relates to the product that they're selling, and then tailoring the message to me in a way that might resonate. So great. On the surface, that's great. But the state of mind that I was in when I opened that email was feeling super weighed down by constrained resources. I was feeling anxious, frustrated, feeling like there was no way out. And so when I opened this email and this person was quoting the thing that I was precisely having a hard time with in that very moment, it almost felt like they were like, look at this, you love this stuff so much, so here's more of it. And so my mind was just spiraling. I just started to spiral. It's sort of like a similar feeling of I think about how one time I was standing front row at Madison Square Garden at a Kygo concert. And I'm standing there and there's like all the speakers around, but there's one speaker that's like right in front of me. And the music is so loud. The bass is so resonant to where I could feel it in my body. And there was so much bass that I started to only feel the bass in my body. And then I was like, wait, I think my heart is beating. Is my heart beating? And it was like, I could tap into my heartbeat, but it was beating at a different rhythm than the bass coming out of the speakers. And so I remember having this moment of like, stop everything, tune everything out. Let me just focus on my heartbeat. Let me take my pulse, because it's like, am I alive? Like, it felt like the bass sort of made my heart skip beats. And I was sort of having this like panic. So if I'm like standing in Madison Square Garden in the front row and I would try to relate it to like receiving this email from the salesperson, it's almost like if I'm in Madison Square Garden and there's a speaker that's so loud right in front of me, it's almost like somebody else brings in another speaker, puts it on the opposite side of me, and they're like, we know you love music because that's why you're here. So here, take another speaker because we know that we just want you to hear the music a little bit better. And it's like, this is the opposite of what I need right now. And so my mind was going on such a spiral because I was like, this is the last thing that I need. And now you're probably sitting there being like, okay, we know that you're mad about this, you're triggered by this. You're probably also thinking about an example in your head of like how this situation has been true in your life. You're probably wondering, okay, well, why are you so triggered by this? And what about this is so triggering? And, you know, I think for me, I'm so triggered by this because of the fact that I even thought that to begin with. And I'm also so triggered by the fact that I even presented myself in this way. I've had this before, though, when it comes to my LinkedIn profile. Like, I'll go through, as I'm going through job searches and stuff, I'll update the LinkedIn profile, not read it for a couple years, and then I'll come back and reread it and be like, ah, that's why I ended up in that job. And so, you know, receiving this email from the salesperson has almost forced me to look back at my LinkedIn profile to see like, oh my God, like I said this from the jump that, you know, I have expertise in making the most out of constrained resources. And so of course that would lead me to being in my current reality of living in this world, in this particular environment of just constrained resources. What I was essentially saying and have been saying in my LinkedIn profile is like, hey, pick me for this. I'm great at making the most out of constrained resources. So if you have an environment where there are constrained resources, pick me. But you know, what makes me sad though is just thinking about the chapter of life I was in when I even wrote that. Because I remember the day where I wrote that LinkedIn about section. I remember sitting down and literally asking myself, okay, well, what sets me apart? And, you know, I wrote that at a time when I was taking time off of work to recover from burnout. And, you know, I don't think I was fully recovered from being in the stage of burnout in order to recognize this. But in hindsight, having to make the most out of constrained resources is what contributed to burnout in the first place. By writing this on my LinkedIn profile, not only was I saying that I accept environments where there are constrained resources, I'm also implying that I'm okay with accepting roles that are outside of my zone of genius. And when I say zone of genius, I'm talking about the things that you're so drawn to, the activities that come to you so naturally. And every time you work on those activities, it's like time flies. You totally lose track of time and you come out of it and you're so energized and it's like your soul is fueled again. So by me putting this whole like I'm an expert in making the most out of constrained resources, I'm unintentionally inviting recruiters to recruit me for roles that are outside of my zone of genius. And, hindsight is totally 2020 though, because, I know that at the time when I was in that stage of burnout, I knew what had caused it. I knew that it was a high workload, not enough support, not feeling like I really aligned with anyone I worked with. And then I also was very aware of the symptoms of burnout for me, which were stomach aches. It was total loss of motivation. It was feeling just chronically depleted. It was a lack of direction and just generally feeling like I didn't care about excelling in my work. I knew that my circumstances had led me to feeling this way, but I think the longer I took time off of work, the more disconnected I became from how I got into this place. And, because I was really only focusing on the fact that, like, okay, are my symptoms still here or not? Am I still feeling no motivation at all, or is the motivation back? And so the whether or not I had motivation to do anything was sort of the signal to me as to whether or when I was ready to move forward. And so, when I felt like I had that motivation come back, I felt like I could move forward. But what I wasn't doing and what I didn't necessarily take the time to dig deep enough on is really investigating, like, why am I putting myself in environments where there are constrained resources in the first place? So as I've been just mad about somebody taking my words and repeating them back to me, I've also been asking myself why and trying to dig deeper on the why, because I know that there's pain behind the anger. I think the pain comes from being in environments early on in my life where there were constrained resources. There were levels of support, but there were almost like outages in support in some areas. And so the environment didn't feel fully supportive. And so by being in those environments, I had to get really good at navigating through them and making the most out of constrained resources in order to survive, in order to get what I want, in order to get my needs met. And through that, I became an expert in making the most out of constrained resources. And I think that's also part of what's so frustrating to me, which is like my environment taught me to be an expert in the thing that I was only ever doing out of survival. It wasn't something that I truly enjoyed. It was actually something that I really hated and I really resented. And what those environments didn't do is teach me how to be an expert in the things that light me up. And, I think a lot of us feel this. I think this is like one of the biggest things that all of us as humans have to go through. It's like society or psychologically, we're always going to prioritize the things that equal survival versus more of the quote unquote nice to haves of like the things that allow us to thrive, because you have to survive in order to thrive. It's like the hierarchy of needs, right? But I do think that's so sad that we have to become the expert in things out of survival. And, those are the things that later set us apart from others, like in a job search. And so when it comes to like writing your LinkedIn about section, you're sitting there thinking like, oh, what sets me apart? Well, It's the things that I become super good at out of survival. And it's like, of course, that's the answer, right? Like, of course. And even as I'm saying that, like maybe that's the wrong frame for a LinkedIn profile to begin with. And, you could probably insert like any other example. It's like a dating profile as well. It's like, what if you just don't lead with what you're an expert in? And what if instead you just lead with the vision, lead with your vision? And because inherently in that vision is what lights you up. So by becoming an expert in this thing that we had to learn out of survival, and then sort of taking that in as part of the thing that sets us apart, I think that also just like perpetuates us being in these environments, because if we're constantly thinking to ourselves like, oh yeah, I'm an expert in making the most out of constrained resources, I'm either subconsciously or consciously, mostly subconsciously probably, going to be looking for or attracting or be okay with environments of constrained resources. So essentially, I've learned to tout the thing that I hate. And, sometimes I have to look at this through a completely different context. Like, and by that I mean taking the same energetics that I'm like feeling in career and place them in a scenario that's in a different category of my life. Because like I said, career feels so high stakes to me, to where there's so much, it oftentimes feels like there's so much riding on it in certain ways, to where it's sometimes hard to see clearly or hard to understand like where I'm settling basically. And so now let's take hand washing clothes, for example. If you've only ever lived in environments where, let's say you don't have a washer or dryer, so you have to hand wash your clothes. You have no other choice but to hand wash your clothes. So over time, by doing that over and over and over again, you're going to become an expert in hand washing clothes. You've easily put in your 10,000 hours. Like, you are an expert. You also start to believe that you're an expert because you're seeing how incredible you're able to hand wash these clothes and make sure that their quality is preserved and get them looking so clean. Like, if you have a stain on it, oh my God, you're so good at getting the stain out. Like, you start to believe that you're an expert in this. And then you start going around telling people, hey, I'm an expert in this because I've gotten really good at it because I've spent so much time doing it. It's just something in your toolkit that you're very good at. But if you believe you're an expert in hand washing and you've only ever existed in environments where you had no washer and dryer, it makes perfect sense that you would search for that similar environment moving forward. So in your next home, you would probably be okay with not having a washer and dryer. And maybe you would prefer not to have a washer and dryer because you're the hand washing clothes expert, And if you go around telling everyone that you're an expert in hand washing clothes, everyone is going to start to bring you their clothes to hand wash. But plot twist, you hate hand washing clothes. And it takes you a while, but eventually you stop and you're like, oh my God, why am I touting the thing that I hate? Why am I telling everyone that I love to hand wash clothes when it's the worst thing ever? And I actually resent it. It's that same sentiment of what I've been feeling about this whole like making the most out of constrained resources. But I think it's also important to point out that like if we are and when we are in these situations where it's like, oh my God, I've been touting the thing that I hate, I think it's important for us to say like, okay, this is my current reality, but it's not my current truth. And it's not something that is going to define me. And really, it's on us, it's on you, it's on me to show up in a way that reflects our current truths. and to show a multi-dimensional view. It's like we aren't just one thing, we're more than one thing. And, I think even though we can get sort of focused on this like one thing of like, oh yeah, we're an expert in this or we're really good at that, and that's the thing that we prop up, while we can sort of forget about these other parts of ourselves that bring incredible value to people's lives, I think there are always going to be people in our own lives who will always hold that multi-dimensional view of you. And by that, I mean, like, because these people know every single part of you or most parts of you, they also know what your zone of genius is. And they know what things you do when you feel so lit up and so just like energized and refueled. And, I think these people in our lives serves as such important reminders along our journey of like, they're the people who can direct us or redirect us to get us on the path where it's like, yes, we are operating in our zone of genius. We are doing the things that light us up and that we're so naturally good at. And, I think about these examples for myself, and there's a handful of people in my life who I don't necessarily see them often, but when I do see them, it's almost like a checkpoint along my journey. And, these are the people who I've known for over half my life, and they've seen so many different dimensions of me. And they also very much know what my zone of genius is, and they've witnessed it. And one of the more recent times of like running into this group of people or these select few people, I remember them asking me like, oh, what are you doing for a job, right? And I remember describing my job to them. And I don't know if you've ever had this when you've told somebody who's like a very, very dear friend of yours, like you tell them what you're up to and it just like straight up does not land. Like they intake the information and then it's almost like, yeah, that's not you. And at that same time, it's like all the energy just like fizzles or like it just dies. Like everything dies and they almost like become dead inside. And that probably sounds a little bit dramatic, but I had this experience where I was telling somebody who's super dear to me of like, yeah, this is what I'm up to. And literally all the energy died in the room. It was almost, yeah, like all the energy got sucked out of the room. And their first question back to me was, what about your creativity? What about graphic design? What about art? What about the creative pursuits that bring you so much joy? This person in particular, like for whatever reason, and I think this is fascinating and it makes sense. The era of mine that has stuck with them all these years was my era of majoring in graphic design in college and like constantly pursuing creative projects. Like every single week I was working on a different project. And that's, while I'm so far beyond that era, that's the era that has always stuck with this person, which I think is fascinating. And so whenever, there have been several different times where this person has like brought this era back up to me of like, but what about creativity? Like you're stepping away from it. Like, what about creativity though? And what they're saying with that is like, if I put these into slightly different words, they're saying that you're in your zone of genius when you're doing creative things, when you're following your creativity, when you're doing XYZ things that relate to art. and relate to expressing yourself. And they're essentially saying, like, I can see that you're not operating in your zone of genius. And so how can we get you back on to operating in your zone of genius? And that's really like what these interactions represent for me. But I think these sorts of connections can really help us figure out how to close the gap in other areas. So like the people who see these multi dimensions of us, there's a much smaller gap between how you see yourself and how this other person sees you. Like the gap is quite small because they have a full picture of you. But for people who you only show like one dimension of yourself to, and you've only given them one thing to see, of course the gap between how you see yourself and how they see you is going to be much wider. So even though, let's say you've only given somebody one thing to see, and they take your words and repeat them back to you, and you find yourself in the state where you're just pissed off, I think the good news is that when you hear your words back and they feel like they no longer resonate, that's such an amazing sign of growth and just almost like a pat on the back or just like encouragement to continue evolving. Like you've come so far and we haven't come this far just to come this far. Like, let's keep going. And so I think in a way it does feel really encouraging. But I also think we just have to give ourselves grace and permission to outgrow old versions of ourselves. And while it's super important to feel all the feelings of just being mad that somebody repeated the words that you once said and they said them back to you, I think that's also such helpful information because it shows you where the gap is. And what I'm realizing in all of this is you have to constantly teach people how to see you. It takes repetition and constantly building evidence to show who you are. And, that could be in any sort of capacity. It's like in daily interactions. It's in your habits. It's in the words you speak. It's in what you put out into the world. It's in what you put online. It's what you put on a resume. You have to constantly tell people who you currently are. It reminds me of this Pinterest quote that I saw the other day, which is something along the lines of, it's not verbatim, but something along the lines of, if you aren't actively shaping what you want your future to be, if you aren't actively shaping that in the present, so much time is going to pass. And then eventually one day you're going to take a step back and be like, I never actually did the things that I wanted to do. And now I'm sitting here with the pain of having all this time pass. And I think the same thing applies here, which is if you don't actively show and voice who you currently are, as time passes, you're still going to evolve. You're going to be evolving behind the scenes. But like, as time passes, you're just going to feel more misunderstood because the person they knew then isn't necessarily the person that you are today. And so it's on us to bring people along on the journey with us. And, almost like as scary or as, difficult or uncomfortable as this can be sometimes, it's also like normalizing just like evolving in front of others. And that's something that I'm like currently working through and having to navigate through. There is definitely an element of discomfort, but there's also so much reward and just like satisfaction on the other side of that. And so I think it's on us to constantly be teaching people who we currently are. And we have to be the ones to connect the dots for people, and while that may feel like a a big to-do or like this daunting task, there is so much freedom that comes with being able to tell your own story and being able to approach it from different angles. And maybe sometimes you approach your story at a different angle depending on who you're talking to or depending on the friend that you're like saying it to. And, there's so much beauty that comes from this. And I think that, what I'm really facing right now, and I would imagine you are too, this feels like a very sort of like collective thing that people are experiencing, is like having to really speak up about who you currently are and how you're evolving and what you truly want, right? Because it's like, in this example of mine, right? It's like, I don't want to be in a space where I'm having to make the most out of constrained resources. I don't want that to be the selling point of me. And I think what I'm realizing is that the angle I need to get to, and I am taking steps to get there, but I think it's more so vocalizing this is like, I'm needing to step into my zone of genius, and like what in my life needs to go away in order for me to purely just focus on my zone of genius, which is creating things, whatever, on whatever medium that is, right? And it's storytelling. It's how do you communicate messages to people? And that's something that I'm just like so just like drawn to. And that is fully where, when I'm in that zone and in that state, that's when time just flies by. And I think we're all really being asked to figure out what our zone of genius is. Like, what is that thing that time just like flies when you're doing it? I think this is just a big thing that we all have to look at. But the having somebody take your words that you once said and repeating them back to you, I think that's an amazing window into what you truly want. It's like, why are you so mad that they said this back to you? And why, like, how can you dig deep enough to get to the root to understand why you're putting yourself in these situations? And I would imagine that your zone of genius is likely the opposite or somewhat of the opposite of what you're triggered about. So like for me, for example, it's like I'm triggered about this world of constrained resources when really I want to be living in this world where there's just like, it's super flowy. It's all this creative energy. It's all this open space to be creative. It's just, it's like giving myself all the tools that I need to be creative. And so that's, I think anytime we're triggered in this way, I think it's a wonderful window into figuring out like, what do we really want? So thank you so much for being here today. If you enjoyed this episode, please give a 5-star review. Or if you listened and you thought of a friend who you were like, oh my God, this person needs to hear this, or this is this person, like please send them the episode. I would love to bring them into the conversation. I hope you have a great week. I'll see you next week. Bye.